On the night of March 30th, 1990, two F-16 fighter jets scrambled into Belgian airspace. Their target wasn't a hostile aircraft. It wasn't a smuggler or a downed weather balloon. It was a silent, triangular object that had already been tracked by 3 separate ground radar stations and seen by thousands of ordinary people looking up at the same patch of sky. For 4 minutes, the pilot's own radar locked onto it. And then, 4 times, it outran them. This is the story of the Belgian UFO wave, the only mass sighting in modern history that a national government has ever officially confirmed, on the record, in its own words. Belgium, late 1989. A small, densely populated country wedged between France, Germany, and the Netherlands. Not the kind of place associated with UFO folklore. But starting in November of that year, something changed. Multiple witnesses in the town of Eupen, near the German border, began reporting a large, dark object hovering low over the countryside. Silent, slow-moving, with 3 or 4 bright lights arranged in a triangle, and a 4th, weaker light, pulsing at its center. The witnesses weren't UFO enthusiasts. They were police officers. On the night of November 29th, 1989, 2 gendarmes on patrol spotted the object themselves, radioed it in, and were joined by colleagues from a second patrol car. Both crews watched it for close to 20 minutes. Word spread fast. In the weeks that followed, Belgium's gendarmerie, the national police force, began fielding hundreds of similar reports from towns across the eastern part of the country. The pattern was consistent. A large, dark, triangular shape. Silent. Slow. Flying low. Often below 1,000 feet. Witnesses described it as roughly the size of a football field. By the time investigators started taking the reports seriously, they had over 140 separate sightings on file from that first wave alone, filed by farmers, truck drivers, and multiple law enforcement officers who had no obvious motive to fabricate a story. The Belgian gendarmerie did something almost unheard of for a police agency. They asked a civilian organization, SOBEPS, the Belgian Society for the Study of Space Phenomena, to help them investigate. The wave built for months. Then, on the night of March 30th into the 31st, 1990, it reached its peak. Beginning around 10:30 p.m., police stations across eastern Belgium started receiving near-simultaneous calls. A triangular object with lights was moving slowly across the sky above the towns of Ramillies, Eupen, and beyond, visible to hundreds of people at once. This time, the object wasn't just seen, it was tracked. The Traffic Control and Reporting Center, the military radar station responsible for Belgian airspace, picked up an unidentified return matching the reported position. Ground-based ADS radar operators sent it in. Then, a NATO air defense radar station confirmed the same unidentified target, independently. 3 radar systems, 1 unexplained contact. Belgium's Air Force made the decision to scramble. At 05 a.m., 2 F-16 fighters lifted off, guided toward the contact by ground control. What happened next was recorded in the official Air Force report. As the F-16 pilot's onboard radar locked onto the target, the object reacted. Witnesses on the ground and instrumentation in the jets described sudden, extreme changes in speed and altitude. Accelerations that, if the readings were accurate, exceeded what any known aircraft of the era could survive. 4 separate times, the pilots achieved a radar lock. 4 separate times, the object broke contact and vanished from their scopes, only to reappear elsewhere moments later. The F-16 never got a visual identification. After roughly 75 minutes in the air, they returned to base, the mystery unresolved. What happened next set the Belgian case apart from nearly every other UFO incident on record. The Belgian Air Force didn't bury the report. It didn't classify it out of existence. Major General Wilfried de Broer, Deputy Chief of Staff of Operations, went on the record, publicly confirming the radar contact, the scramble, and the failed intercept, while stopping short of saying what the object actually was. It remains one of the only instances of a NATO member's Air Force publicly acknowledging an unexplained radar-confirmed intercept of an unidentified object. In the country's own official statements, not through a leak, and not decades later through a declassification request. 9 days after the intercept, on April 4th, 1990, a man near the village of Petit Rachin came forward with something no other witness had. A photograph. It showed a dark triangular craft, lights at each corner, hovering against a night sky, matching, almost exactly, the shape described by hundreds of witnesses over the previous months. The image became the defining picture of the entire wave. It was printed in newspapers, analyzed by photographic experts, and for 2 decades stood as the single strongest piece of physical evidence in the case. In July of 2011, 21 years after the photograph was taken, the photographer came forward again. He admitted the image was a hoax, a small suspended model, photographed at night with a long exposure to simulate scale and distance. The confession didn't erase the sightings, the radar data, or the Air Force's own statement, but it did remove the case's single most famous piece of visual proof, and it left investigators and the public with an uncomfortable question that still follows the Belgian wave today. How much of a genuine, well-documented, multiply-witnessed event had been quietly reshaped by one fabricated photograph? Long after the photograph was debunked, the radar data itself came under fresh scrutiny. In the mid-2000s, a technical reanalysis by Belgian investigators, including radar specialists who had access to the original tracking data, concluded that the extreme accelerations recorded that night were most likely the product of a known radar phenomenon. Signal interference between the ground station and the fighter's own onboard systems, creating false returns that looked like impossible maneuvers. That reassessment didn't explain away the hundreds of independent visual sightings reported over the preceding months. It only addressed one narrow, dramatic piece of the case: the chase itself. What it left standing was harder to dismiss. A sustained, months-long wave of consistent eyewitness reports, filed in real time by people including trained police officers, that has never been fully and officially explained. The Belgian UFO wave never produced a crashed craft, a recovered body, or a document stamped classified and later leaked. What it produced instead was something rarer: an ordinary government agency on the record, saying it did not know what its own radar had tracked. By the time the wave faded out in 1990, SOBEPS had logged more than 2,000 individual reports. Whether the source was a secret prototype aircraft, a rare atmospheric or radar phenomenon compounded across an entire population, or something that still has no name, Belgium remains the case most often cited by researchers as the closest thing to an official, government-corroborated UFO event in modern European history. And somewhere in an archive outside Brussels, the original radar logs from that night in March are still on file, read, reread, and still not fully agreed upon, more than 3 decades later. Thousands of witnesses, 3 independent radar stations, 2 fighter jets, and a government that never denied what its own instruments recorded. The photograph turned out to be fake. The rest of the case never has been explained.